For 10 days, the brutal murder of two small children was a mystery. The crime scene was a nightmare of chaos, but there was no clear motive, and police had no witnesses. Except, there was one person who saw everything. One person who could give investigators the answers they so desperately needed. The problem? She was in a hospital bed, her own life hanging by a thread, lost in the silent depths of a coma. This is the story of how she woke up, and how her first words from the other side of darkness would unmask a killer no one saw coming. Before March 17, 2008, life for 23-year-old Emma Jangestig was finally looking up. She was carefully and lovingly rebuilding her world from the ashes of a past relationship. In the small, historic town of Arboga, Sweden, a peaceful community where everyone felt safe, Emma was building her future. After a tough divorce, the thoughtful and compassionate young woman was moving forward with a new sense of purpose, focused entirely on her two beautiful children. Her world revolved around them. There was Max, her bright, energetic 3-year-old, and his little sister, Saga, a sweet and curious toddler of just 1. They were her everything. After her marriage to their father, Nicholas Jangestig, ended, Emma made the brave decision to start over. She and the kids moved to Arboga, a town about 150 kilometers from Stockholm, looking for a slower pace and a safe place to raise her family. It was there she found love again with a man named Torgny Helgren. He was kind and patient, and even though Max and Saga weren't his, he embraced them as his own. Together, the 4 of them were becoming a blended family, their small home filled with the laughter of toddlers and the quiet hum of a happy life. Just 2 months before the tragedy, they had bought a house together, a symbol of their future. It seemed like Emma had found everything she was looking for: a loving partner, a stable home, and a bright future for her kids. The past was behind her, but lurking in the shadows of this idyllic new life was a dark, venomous obsession, and it was about to shatter their world in the most horrific way imaginable. Arboga wasn't the kind of place where people locked their doors at night. It was small, quiet, and steeped in history, the kind of Swedish town where life moved slowly and predictably, where church bells marked the passing of time, and everyone knew which family lived in which yellow or red wooden house. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and on most evenings, you could hear the distant laughter of children playing in their gardens before bedtime. For Emma Jangestig, this peaceful rhythm was exactly what she needed. It was the perfect backdrop for rebuilding a life that had been cracked but not broken. After the collapse of her marriage, she was determined to create a stable, loving world for her 2 young children, Max and Saga. Arboga offered that promise, a safe place where she could exhale for the first time in years. Emma cherished routine. She found comfort in the small rituals that made her feel grounded. Waking up to Max climbing into her bed each morning, chattering excitedly about a dream he'd had, hearing Saga's tiny feet pattering on the floor as she toddled toward the kitchen, preparing breakfast while sunlight streamed through the windows and reflected off the children's drawings taped to the fridge. Max, just 3 years old, was a bright flame, the kind of child who filled every room with his energy. His blonde hair always stuck up in the mornings. His cheeks were rosy, and his laughter bounced off the walls. He was deeply curious about everything, constantly asking questions, constantly on the move. He loved toy cars, loved helping Emma wipe the table after meals, and loved being the big brother. If Saga cried, Max was the first to run to her, offering a stuffed animal or patting her back in an attempt to soothe her. Saga, barely 1 year old, was quieter, but endlessly observant. Her wide blue eyes took in everything, and she followed Max everywhere he went, copying him with charming determination. She had recently begun walking on her own, her tiny, unsteady steps becoming a source of endless joy for Emma. There was something magical about watching the two of them together, two small souls discovering the world in tandem. And then there was Torgny. After the divorce, Emma didn't think she'd find love again, not the safe, steady kind she needed. But meeting Torgny Helgren changed everything. He was calm where she was anxious, patient where she was scattered, and warm where her life had once felt cold. He worked in marketing, often traveling or putting in long hours, but he always made time for Emma and the children. He read bedtime stories, carried Saga on his shoulders, and taught Max how to build little wooden towers. He wasn't their biological father, but he showed up in every way that mattered. For Emma, this was more than a relationship. It was a second chance at the life she had never thought she'd get back. The little home they bought together just 2 months before the tragedy symbolized this new beginning, a place where they planned for birthdays, holidays, and the simple chaos of raising kids. Even Emma's relationship with her ex-husband, Nicholas, had settled into a manageable rhythm. They weren't close, but they communicated for the sake of the children. Their calls were brief but civil. Max and Saga loved hearing from their father. Emma worked hard to keep that connection alive, because she believed children deserved love from both parents, no matter how hard the past had been. Their life was far from glamorous. It was ordinary in the most beautiful way. Evening dinners around the kitchen table. The kids splashing water at bath time. Emma scrolling through recipes while Saga napped on her chest. Torgny helping Max pick out pajamas. Plans for repainting the living room. Dreams of summer trips. The kind of moments people often take for granted, but that Emma treasured deeply because she knew how fragile stability could be. She believed with her whole heart that the worst was behind her. She had climbed out of difficulty, rebuilt her life piece by piece, and created a home that finally felt safe. But what Emma didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that this precious, fragile life was not only being watched, it was being targeted. Not by a stranger lurking in the shadows, not by a criminal seeking money or revenge, but by a ghost from someone else's past. A ghost driven not by reason, but by obsession, an obsession strong enough to warp love into hatred, longing into rage, and heartbreak into something monstrous. And this ghost was getting closer. March 17, 2008, didn't announce itself as a day that would change everything. In fact, it looked like any other early spring morning in Arboga. The chill of winter still clung to the air, but the light lasted a little longer each day. Emma walked the children to daycare, bundled in hats and warm jackets. Max ran ahead, as always, eager to get inside and see his friends. Saga held Emma's hand tightly, her cheeks pink from the cold. Emma spent the day doing ordinary things: grocery shopping, cleaning, preparing for dinner. She texted Torgny about their plans for the weekend. She talked briefly with a neighbor. Nothing felt unusual. Nothing felt threatening. That was the most frightening part, how normal everything was. It was only later, in hindsight, that the small signs would stand out. A woman a neighbor didn't recognize, walking past Emma's house. An unfamiliar car idling on a nearby street. The eerie silence that seemed to hang in the air that evening. But on that day, Emma simply felt grateful. Life was busy and tiring, but it was good. She had no way of knowing that for someone else, this day was not ordinary at all. It was the day they had chosen, the day they had prepared for, the day they intended to destroy her life completely. And as the sun set over Arboga, casting a warm orange glow over the quiet streets, the countdown had already begun. Night in Arboga usually wrapped the town in a soft, peaceful quiet, the kind that makes you believe nothing bad could ever happen there. But on March 17, 2008, a different kind of quiet settled over the small, yellow house where Emma Jangastig lived with her children and her partner. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of bedtime routines and tired toddlers finally drifting off to sleep. It was a heavy, unnatural silence, the kind that arrives right before something terrible happens. The kind you only recognize in hindsight. Emma spent the early evening as she always did, moving between the kitchen and the children's rooms, tidying toys, folding laundry, preparing for the next day. Saga's pajamas were laid neatly on her bed. Max's dinosaur plushie was waiting for him under the blanket they had tucked around him hours earlier. The house smelled faintly of pancakes, Max's favorite, and the soft hum of the fridge was the only sound echoing in the stillness. Around 8 p.m., the sky outside was already dark. Streetlights flickered softly in the distance, casting long shadows across the wooden fencing outside. Nothing felt unusual, nothing alarming, but somewhere far away, though not far enough, a woman named Christine Schürrer was making her way toward Emma's home. And she wasn't coming to talk. She wasn't coming to reconcile. She wasn't even coming out of desperation. She was coming to destroy. Christine had been in Emma's orbit long before this night, not by Emma's choice, but because of someone from her past, Emma's ex-partner, Nicholas. Christine had fallen deeply, irrationally, obsessively in love with him. But that love had curdled into bitterness when she realized Nicholas did not return her feelings, not in the way she wanted. In her mind, Emma was the obstacle, the enemy, the reason her relationship with Nicholas had not become the life she imagined. And over months, that resentment had grown into something poisonous. Christine wasn't a stranger to Emma's children. She had seen Max and Saga before. She had been around them. And to some degree, she resented them, too, symbols of a life she wanted but could never have. On this night, driven by rage and delusion, she came to take it all away. Late that night, after the children had gone to sleep, Emma settled into bed. The house was quiet, warm, and safe. The kind of safety a mother imagines is unbreakable until it isn't. At some point between 11 p.m. and midnight, the front door quietly opened. Christine had found a way inside. Whether through an unlocked door, a weak latch, or a slow, calculated force. The details have never been perfectly clear. But what is clear is that she entered with purpose. She came not as a thief, but as an executioner. She moved quietly through the darkened hallway, her steps deliberate, her breaths slow. In her hand was a blunt weapon, heavy, hard, chosen for damage, not intimidation. One room down the hall held a young child dreaming of dinosaurs. Another held a baby sleeping peacefully in her crib. Christine did not hesitate. She did not reflect. She did not feel remorse. She walked into Max's room first. The attack was swift and brutal. Max never had a chance to scream for his mother, never had a chance to run. Christine struck him repeatedly, blows so violent that they left no doubt of her intent. In the next room, she turned her rage toward little Saga, a 1-year-old child who posed no threat, who could barely speak. Saga never woke up again. After murdering both children, Christine moved toward Emma's bedroom. She stood over her, raising the weapon, and brought it down with the same merciless fury. The first blow split skin and bone. Emma awoke in confusion, in terror. In a nightmare she couldn't understand. Instinctively, she raised her arms to protect herself, but the blows kept coming, to her skull, her face, her hands. Everything went dark. Time seemed to collapse. The house fell back into silence. Christine, covered in blood that was not her own, slipped back out into the night. She left the same way she came, quietly, unnoticed, disappearing into the darkness, while the bodies of 2 children lay still in their beds, and a mother clung to life inside her home. Hours passed before anyone realized what had happened. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the windows, touching the walls with a warmth that felt painfully at odds with the scene unfolding inside. Torgny arrived first. He had spent the night away due to work, unaware of the nightmare waiting behind the door. When he entered the house, something felt wrong immediately. The stillness was too absolute, too unnatural. None of the usual morning chaos greeted him. No Max running toward him. No Saga babbling. No Emma calling out from the bedroom. As he stepped farther into the house, he called Emma's name. No answer. He called again, louder. Still nothing. Then he saw the first smear of blood. Panic surged through him, cold and electric. He rushed down the hallway and found Max first. Still, silent, lifeless. His small body brutally beaten. Torgny collapsed to his knees, choking on a grief too big for words. He forced himself to his feet, forcing himself to move to Saga's room, her crib, her tiny form. The same horrific violence. Screaming, sobbing, completely unmoored, he stumbled into the master bedroom and found Emma. She was lying in a pool of her own blood, her face barely recognizable, bones shattered, skull crushed. But unlike the children, she was breathing. Barely, but breathing. Torgny dialed emergency services, his voice shaking so violently he could barely form words. Paramedics arrived within minutes, rushing through the house, quickly confirming the children were gone. Emma was rushed into the ambulance. Her pulse was faint. Her injuries were catastrophic. Doctors did not expect her to survive the night. They did not expect her to survive the week. And even if she did, they warned, she would likely suffer permanent brain damage. She had been struck more than a dozen times, blows so severe that pieces of her skull had fractured inward. But somehow, her heart kept beating. Emma was placed into a medically induced coma as surgeons worked desperately to repair the massive trauma. Metal plates were inserted to reconstruct parts of her skull. Tubes and machines kept her alive. Outside the hospital room, family, neighbors, police, and reporters gathered in stunned disbelief. The brutality was unlike anything Arboga had ever seen. The town was shattered. Hearts were broken. Everyone whispered the same questions. Who could do something like this? Why the children? Why Emma? Was the killer still out there? While investigators worked tirelessly to piece together the fragments of that horrific night, something even more extraordinary was happening behind the walls of the ICU. Against every medical prediction, against every expectation, against every statistic, Emma's brain began to fight. And slowly, impossibly, she started to wake up. What no one knew yet was this. The moment Emma opened her eyes, the entire investigation and the entire fate of the killer would change forever. Silence is strange in a hospital. It's never truly silent, not really. There's always something humming. Machines beeping in steady rhythm, nurses whispering, carts rolling down long white corridors. But inside Emma's room, the silence felt heavier. It wasn't the absence of sound, it was the absence of her. For days she lay motionless, suspended between life and death, as if floating in some quiet, unreachable space. Tubes fed her breaths. Machines kept her heart steady. Bandages wrapped around her head protected the fragile reconstruction of her skull. To anyone walking by, she looked peaceful, almost asleep. But the doctors knew better. They knew the violence she had survived. They knew the odds. And they didn't believe she would return. The medical team spoke in hushed tones outside her door, discussing the swelling in her brain, the extent of the fractures, the places where bone had shattered and lodged where it shouldn't have. They talked about possible complications: speech loss, memory impairment, permanent cognitive disabilities. They talked about Emma's life, but always as though it were already gone. Yet through all their realism, all their clinical certainty, there was something they didn't understand, something no machine in that room could measure: a mother's will. Outside the ICU, the world was reeling. Emma's family had become fixtures in the waiting area, taking turns holding vigil by her door. They cried, prayed, whispered reassurances to themselves. She's strong. She'll wake up. She has to. But the truth hung over all of them like a storm cloud. Max and Saga were gone. 2 small coffins had been laid to rest in the earth. 2 small souls ripped from the world before they could grow, laugh, live. Their loss rippled through Arboga like an earthquake. The entire town grieved. And hovering in the middle of that grief was Emma, alive, but silent. The police needed her to speak. The community needed her to survive. Her family needed her to come back. But Emma remained still, breathing through machines, locked somewhere inside the deepest corners of her injured brain. Meanwhile, the investigation had begun to widen. The crime scene had been processed, photos taken, evidence collected. Detectives scoured the house for fingerprints, footprints, any trace of the killer. But the brutality had been swift and chaotic. Blood obscured surfaces. Objects were broken. The scene was full of noise, confusion, difficult to decipher. Detectives interviewed neighbors, but in a town like Arboga, no one expected to witness violence. No one had seen a stranger. No one had heard screams. The killer had been careful. The killer had been quick. And the killer had vanished. Without Emma's testimony, investigators had very little. They knew this hadn't been a robbery. Nothing was missing. They knew this wasn't random. The children had been targeted first. They knew the killer was someone filled with rage, but rage directed at what? At whom? Theories surfaced, each darker than the last. Had someone held a grudge? Had someone from Emma's past returned? Had someone wanted revenge? Or was this something far more personal? Something rooted in jealousy, obsession, madness. Detectives took statements from everyone close to the family: Emma's friends, her neighbors, her parents, and of course, her ex-partner Nicholas. Nicholas was distraught, sobbing through the interviews. The guilt of losing his children weighed on him like stone. But investigators noticed something in his story. Not guilt of murder, but something else. There was a woman. Nicholas described an ex-girlfriend who hadn't taken their breakup well. Someone who wanted a deeper relationship with him than he could give. Someone who had visited Arboga once, uninvited. Someone whose behavior had grown increasingly unpredictable. Her name was Christine Schürrer. But even with this information, it wasn't enough. Investigators couldn't build a case on instinct. They needed proof. They needed direction. They needed Emma. Days passed, then a week, then another. Emma lay in the bed, fragile and unmoving, as though trapped underwater. Nurses spoke to her gently, hoping their voices might reach some part of her subconscious. Her father stroked her hair. Her mother held her hand and whispered stories from Emma's childhood, as if memory could be a rope pulling her back. Still, nothing. Doctors monitored her brain activity, frowning at the results. There were slight fluctuations, spikes, dips, but nothing that resembled consciousness. Nothing that suggested she was aware of the world around her. But beneath that silence, deep within her battered mind, something was stirring. In coma, the brain fights in strange ways. It replays memories, flashes images, tries to make sense of trauma. It sorts through chaos, like someone digging through rubble after an explosion. And Emma's mind was searching for something. Searching for what happened. Searching for her children. Searching for the truth, buried inside her last moments of consciousness. Then one morning, something different happened. A flutter. Just a small one. A tremor beneath the eyelid. A tiny movement. So tiny, the nurse almost missed it. Then another. Then a faint twitch in her fingers. It was subtle, delicate, but it was the first sign of life beyond survival. The nurse called the doctor immediately. The doctor called Emma's parents. And as the room began to fill with anxious, hopeful faces, Emma's eyes opened. Not all at once, not sharply, but slowly, as though her eyelids were weighted. She didn't speak. She didn't move much. Her gaze was unfocused, drifting. A tear slid down the corner of her face, unbidden, undeniable. A single tear. Her mother gasped. Her father stood frozen. A nurse whispered, "She's back," as if afraid to break the moment. But Emma wasn't back. Not fully. Not yet. Doctors explained that waking up didn't mean understanding. It didn't mean memory. It didn't even mean she knew where she was. But waking up meant hope. The next days were a slow, painful climb. Emma drifted in and out of awareness. Sometimes her eyes moved. Sometimes she squeezed someone's hand. Sometimes she tried to speak, only to produce silence. Her throat too swollen to form sound. Her mind was like a shattered mirror. Images flashed in sharp fragments. Sound came in muffled echoes. Pain surfaced in waves. She didn't know what was real. She didn't know what had happened. But slowly, painfully slowly, the fog began to thin. Her first clear thought wasn't about herself. It was about her children. She looked around the room, eyes scanning for Max and Saga, expecting them to toddle in at any moment. When they didn't, confusion spread across her face. She tried to ask where they were, forming shapes with her mouth, breathing harder, eyes wide with panic. No one knew how to tell her. How do you tell a mother her children are gone? Doctors cautioned her family to wait, to ease her into the truth. But trauma is not something you can ease into. It arrives whether you're ready or not. When Emma finally realized, through broken words, through tears, through the crushing silence, that her children weren't coming, her heart nearly broke again. She sobbed with a sound that seemed too heavy for her fragile body. It was a mother's grief, raw, primal, unbearable. But beneath the heartbreak, something else awakened too. Memory, a flash of the hallway, a silhouette, a woman's face, anger, striking, darkness, the killer. Buried deep inside the trauma, Emma had seen her attacker. And she remembered. Barely alive, her skull fractured, her brain bleeding, she had still seen enough to know who tried to kill her and murdered her children. And as the detective leaned in closer, notebook trembling in his hands, Emma whispered the name that would shatter the investigation wide open. Christine. Everything changed. For 10 long days, the world around Emma Jengestig moved forward, but she didn't. Outside her hospital room, detectives scrambled, family prayed, and an entire nation whispered about the brutal crime that had shaken Sweden to its core. But inside that quiet, dim room in Örebro University Hospital, time was frozen. Machines hummed steadily, keeping her alive, while the greatest mystery of all remained locked behind her closed eyes. Emma was the only person who knew the truth. She had seen her children's killer. She had lived through the unimaginable. But the truth was sealed inside a coma so deep, even doctors didn't know if she would ever return. Her injuries were catastrophic. Multiple skull fractures, severe brain trauma, swelling so dangerous that doctors had no choice but to place her in a medically induced coma. Her survival alone was a medical miracle. But survival wasn't enough. Not for the investigators, not for the grieving families, and not for the small town of Arboga that was desperate for answers. Her family sat beside her bed day after day. Her mother held her hand. Her father whispered to her through tears. Torgny, the man who loved her, sat for hours talking softly to her unconscious form, telling her she wasn't alone, even though she was suspended somewhere far beyond reach. Every beep of the monitor echoed the same haunting question. Would she wake up? And if she did, what would she remember? Doctors had warned the family that waking from a coma can be unpredictable. She might wake with no memory at all. She might wake confused, traumatized, or unable to speak. Or she might never wake at all. For the detectives, Emma's coma wasn't just a medical crisis. It was a dead end. They had no weapon, no fingerprints, no motive, no suspect, no leads, except one faint witness description of a mysterious woman seen near the house. A detail so small, so vague, it was almost useless. Everything depended on Emma. And then, on the 10th day, something changed. It wasn't dramatic. There was no sudden gasp, no cinematic awakening. It began with a twitch, a faint flutter of her eyelids, a moment so small that her mother wasn't even sure she saw it. Then, minutes later, another movement, her fingers curling slightly around her mother's hand. Doctors rushed in. Nurses checked her vitals. Her family held their breath. The slow climb out of the coma had begun. Over the next few hours, Emma drifted in and out of shallow consciousness. Her eyelids flickered. She tried to lift her hand. Her breathing patterns changed. Her brain, bruised, swollen, and fighting, was attempting to reboot itself. When she finally opened her eyes fully, she didn't recognize anything. The ceiling lights, the medical equipment, the faces staring down at her. Her thoughts were fragments. Her memories, scattered pieces of a life violently interrupted. She didn't know where she was, or why. And worst of all, she didn't know where Max and Saga were. Her family avoided the truth at first. Doctors warned that revealing the children's deaths too soon could send her into psychological shock. So they spoke gently, vaguely, but Emma wasn't fooled. She tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Her brain injury made forming sentences impossible. Even simple sounds were trapped behind a wall of trauma. Imagine waking from one nightmare, only to discover you're trapped in another. Unable to move, unable to talk, unable to demand answers. Her confusion slowly shifted to worry, then panic. She looked at her family with pleading eyes. Where are they? What happened? Where are my children? It was her father who finally gave her the truth. Doctors and psychologists stood by as he whispered the words that broke her world a second time. Max and Saga were gone. The room fell silent. Emma didn't scream. She couldn't. But the devastation in her eyes, that silent, soul-deep grief, was unmistakable. Her world had been destroyed, and yet, from the ashes of that grief, something else began to rise. Determination. She couldn't speak, but she could communicate. Slowly, painfully, she learned to blink once for yes, twice for no. Detectives saw the opportunity they'd been praying for. They began the gentlest questioning imaginable. One yes or no question at a time. Was the attacker a man? Emma blinked once. No. Detectives froze. This single blink shifted the investigation entirely. Every assumption they had made collapsed. A woman. The attacker was a woman. Now, the vague witness sighting suddenly made sense. The lack of forced entry made sense. The ferocity of the attack, personal, emotional, began to fit a new profile. Investigators gathered photos of every woman connected to Emma and Torgny. A painstaking process began. Emma was shown one photo at a time. Each image exhausted her. Each moment of concentration made her head pound. But she continued. For Max, for Saga, for justice. Then it happened. When they held up one specific photograph, everything changed. Emma's breathing spiked. Her eyes widened with terror. Her body trembled. Recognition. Raw, unmistakable fear. The memory. The one her brain had buried deep beneath trauma, surfaced like a ghost rising from the depths. She knew this woman. She remembered her. She remembered seeing her outside her door, moments before her life was destroyed. The name behind the face would soon ignite the investigation. Christine Schürrer. And with that silent moment of recognition, Emma Jangistig did what no one else could. She unlocked the truth. She handed police the key that would unravel the entire case. Her flicker of consciousness didn't just return her to life. It turned a cold case into a manhunt. Max and Saga finally had a voice, and justice was no longer a distant hope. It was coming. Emma's awakening changed everything. For 10 days, the police had been investigating blind, moving through a maze without a map, following threads that led to dead ends. Arboga was drowning in grief. The media speculated wildly, and the public was terrified that a violent killer was still out there, free. But now, with one single terrified reaction from Emma, investigators finally had a target. A name, a face, a direction. Christine Schürrer. The moment Emma's eyes widened at the photograph, the entire room shifted. Detectives exchanged looks of quiet shock. They had prepared themselves for anything. A stranger, a neighbor, a random attacker. But not this. Not a woman. Not someone connected so personally to Emma's life. But the more they learned, the more horrifying the picture became. A suspect emerges. Christine had once been romantically involved with Emma's partner, Torgny. She hadn't taken the breakup well. Not well at all. Interviews revealed a disturbing pattern. Christine had a history of jealousy, volatility, and emotional outbursts. She had appeared unannounced at Torgny's home in the past, showing up without warning and without invitation. Witnesses described her as intense, not outwardly violent, but simmering. The kind of person whose emotions could boil over without warning. And then the most chilling detail. Christine had been seen in Arboga the day before the attack. But why? Why travel hours to a small town she had no connection to? Investigators suddenly had a theory. A dark one. Revenge. Obsession. Rejection turned into rage. Yet theory alone wasn't enough. They needed evidence. Tracing the killer's shadow, police began reconstructing Christine's movements. They checked train tickets, examined phone records, interviewed friends, co-workers, neighbors. Piece by piece, a disturbing timeline formed. Christine hadn't simply snapped, she had planned. She traveled from Stockholm to Arboga on March 17th. She stayed in a hostel under a false name. She visited stores where she purchased items police believed were used during the attack. She walked the neighborhood around Emma's home. And then, chillingly, she disappeared from sight just before dawn, the exact window when the murders occurred. Emma's house had no signs of forced entry. The killer had entered quietly, like someone who knew how to approach without attracting attention. This wasn't random. This wasn't chaotic. This wasn't opportunistic. This was deliberate. The forensics. Fight back. Inside the home, the crime scene was horrific, but it also whispered clues. Bloody footprints. Smudges left by gloved hands. Fibers from clothing that didn't belong to Emma, Max, or Saga. An unusual pattern in the blood spatter suggesting the killer was smaller than Emma. A woman's frame. And on one small piece of evidence, a fraction of material so tiny it took hours to isolate, investigators found something monumental. Christine's DNA. It wasn't much. It wasn't enough to convict her alone. But it was enough to hunt her. A killer on the move. By the time police had gathered enough to act, Christine was gone. She had fled Sweden entirely. Detectives couldn't believe it. The moment she realized the police might be onto her, she vanished, moving across countries with alarming speed and precision. She used buses, trains, ferries. She paid in cash. She stayed in low-cost hostels that didn't require ID. She moved like someone who knew what she had done, like someone who intended to disappear. Interpol was alerted. Her photo was circulated across borders. Europol joined the hunt. Sweden had never seen anything like this. An international manhunt for a killer who left 2 children dead and a mother fighting for her life. Every border crossing was monitored. Every checkpoint alerted. Every Scandinavian nation placed on watch. And then, suddenly, a break. A call from Germany. A hostel owner in Leipzig, Germany, recognized her face. Christine had checked in 2 days earlier. She kept to herself, paid in cash, used a different name, Anna Sorensen, the same alias she had used in Sweden. Police rushed to the location. A coordinated German-Swedish operation moved swiftly, quietly, surrounding the building in the early morning hours. Christine was arrested at 7:15. She didn't resist. She didn't deny her identity. She didn't cry. She simply stared at the officers with a cold, detached expression. As if she'd been expecting them. As if she knew this moment would come. Transported back to Sweden. When Christine arrived back in Sweden, the media erupted. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. People crowded court entrances just to see her. Who was she? Why did she do it? What drove a woman with no criminal record to commit such unimaginable violence? Christine said nothing. Not one word. She refused to answer police questions. Refused to show emotion. Refused to provide any explanation. Interrogators were stunned. They had interviewed hundreds of suspects, but few had ever maintained such absolute silence. Christine sat completely still, hands folded, gaze unblinking, as detectives laid out the evidence. Travel records, hostel logs, DNA samples, Witness identifications. Surveillance footage. Emma's recognition. Emma's strength changes everything. Without Emma, the case might still have landed in court. But it wouldn't have been enough. Her memory, hazy, painful, fragmented, became the backbone of the case. Detectives met with her as she slowly recovered in the hospital. Each session was delicate, guided, painfully slow. Emma described the attack. The sounds, the footsteps, the smell, the feel of the first blow, the confusion, the last thing she saw before collapsing. A woman's face, not just any woman, Christine's. This wasn't just eyewitness identification. It was the testimony of a mother who survived a murder attempt. Her words alone could sway a jury. But Emma didn't speak with vengeance. She didn't speak with anger. She spoke with heartbreak, a quiet, trembling strength that no one could fake. A chilling motive emerges. As detectives dug deeper, the motive became painfully clear. Christine had fallen in love with Torgny. Deeply, possessively, obsessively. When he chose Emma instead, something inside Christine broke. Investigators uncovered messages, emails, old conversations that revealed her fixation. Letters begging for attention. Letters accusing him of betrayal. Statements about wanting him no matter what. And then came the most horrifying theory. Christine had not come to Arboga to kill Emma. She had come to destroy the life Emma had built with Torgny. Max and Saga were the targets. The ultimate punishment. The ultimate revenge. Emma was simply collateral damage. This wasn't madness. This wasn't a breakdown. This was cold, calculated brutality. The case was ready. After weeks of work, the investigation was complete. Detectives had everything they needed. A suspect, a motive, forensic evidence, travel records, DNA, witness statements, surveillance footage, Emma's testimony, and a timeline built with chilling precision. Christine was charged with 2 counts of murder, 1 count of attempted murder, 1 count of aggravated assault. The trial would soon begin, but no one, not the detectives, not the lawyers, not the public, could have predicted just how shocking the next chapter would be, or how the truth would finally come to light. Christine Schürrer's arrest had been swift, precise, and international. But capturing her was only the beginning. The real test, the life or death struggle for truth, would take place in the courtroom. From the moment Christine was extradited to Sweden, the country held its breath. The crime had already shaken the nation to its core. A mother nearly beaten to death, 2 toddlers murdered in their sleep, a jealous ex-girlfriend as the prime suspect. It was the kind of case that felt too brutal, too senseless, too calculated to belong in peaceful Sweden. Now, everyone wanted one thing: proof, answers, justice. Because even with Christine in custody, the hunt wasn't over. It had only shifted. Now investigators were hunting the truth. A defense built on denial. Christine refused to speak, not to detectives, not to psychologists, not even to her own lawyers. She sat through every interrogation in complete silence, her face unreadable, her jaw set, her eyes fixed somewhere past the investigators, as if the entire process bored her. Her silence wasn't confusion. It wasn't shock. It wasn't despair. It was strategy. Her lawyers constructed a defense around it. No confession, no motive, no fingerprints, no weapon, no eyewitness, awake at the time of the attack. The brutality of the crime made it almost unbelievable that a woman, a small woman at that, could overpower Emma and brutally kill 2 young children without leaving more behind. Her attorneys would later argue that the investigation was driven by emotion, not evidence. That police had been under pressure to find a villain, and Christine was simply convenient. But every argument they made collapsed under the weight of one reality. Christine had fled Sweden the moment the murders were committed. No innocent person runs across multiple countries under false names. No innocent person carefully disposes of the items they traveled with. No innocent person checks into hostels using different aliases. No innocent person behaves like a ghost trying to erase her own steps. Still, silence is powerful in court. Silence can plant doubt, and Christine understood that. The evidence tightens. One by one, pieces of evidence were brought forward. Small pieces at first: footprints, fibers, travel receipts. Then the bigger pieces: a DNA match, phone records, witness reports. But among all those pieces, one stood out: a stolen bike. A witness had reported that a bicycle was taken from outside Emma's home on the day of the murder. The bike was later found abandoned near Arboga's train station. On it, investigators found a small trace of DNA. Christine's DNA. It wasn't much, it wasn't dramatic, but it was the piece that tied her physically to the scene of the crime. And when combined with her travel pattern, her lies, and Emma's identification, it painted a chilling picture. Emma steps into the light. Emma's recovery was slow, painful, and far from complete. Every day was a battle. The headaches, the dizziness, the memory lapses, the trauma. But when prosecutors asked her whether she felt strong enough to testify, she didn't hesitate. Yes, she would walk into that courtroom, even if she had to be carried. She would face Christine. She would speak for Max and Saga. On the morning of her testimony, the courthouse was silent. Reporters waited outside. Photographers stood ready. Inside, every seat was filled. Emma entered leaning heavily on her father's arm, her steps shaky but determined. Her face was pale, her hair still thin from the trauma, her body weaker than it had ever been. But her presence, the fact that she was standing at all, sent a jolt through the room. This was the woman Christine had tried to destroy. Yet here she was, alive, enduring, unbroken. When she looked toward the defendant's table, Christine stared back with her usual cold, blank expression. But Emma didn't look away. The court fell silent. Her voice trembled as she spoke, but never once did it falter. She described waking up to pounding, darkness, pain exploding behind her eyes, the terror of hearing her children cry, the sight of a woman standing over her, the repeated blows, the coldness in her attacker's eyes, the darkness pulling her down again. And then she pointed at Christine and said, "It was her." A room froze. Christine did not react, but the jury did. Everyone did. Because the truth wasn't coming from detectives. It wasn't coming from lawyers. It was coming from the only survivor of the attack. A mother whose children were murdered. A woman who had nothing left to lose. The timeline that destroyed the defense. With Emma's testimony as the emotional core of the case, prosecutors then presented the cold, logical timeline, and this was what ultimately cornered Christine. March 17th, 2008. Christine travels from Stockholm to Arboga under a false name. March 18th, 2008. Evening. She visits locations near Emma's home. Witnesses report a woman matching her description, loitering. March 19, 2008. Early morning. Emma is attacked. Max and Saga are killed. March 19, 2008. Morning. Christine checks out of her hostel. Buys a ferry ticket. Leaves Sweden immediately. This was not coincidence. This was not confusion. This was execution. The prosecution argued that Christine's motive was simple and chilling. She wanted Torgny back. And she believed that destroying Emma's family would force him to return to her. It wasn't a crime of passion. It was a calculated punishment. The psychology of a killer. Criminal psychologists testified that Christine displayed traits consistent with narcissistic rage, in Coma, obsessive attachment, emotional instability, a desire to control outcomes at any cost, a willingness to remove obstacles through violence. She wasn't insane. She wasn't delusional. She wasn't confused. She was methodical. Everything she did, hiding her identity, traveling across countries, refusing to speak, pointed to someone trying to control the narrative, trying to stay in control of the story. From that moment, trying to win. But the evidence was stronger. The verdict. When the verdict was finally delivered, the courtroom was so silent you could hear someone breathe. Christine sat still, hands folded, completely unmoved. Guilty of murder. Guilty of attempted murder. Guilty of aggravated assault. Life sentence. The judge described her actions as beyond human comprehension, calling the murders of Max and Saga an act of cruelty without parallel in modern Swedish history. Emma cried softly. Not in relief, not in triumph, but in mourning. Because justice doesn't erase pain. It doesn't bring back the dead. It doesn't heal the wounds you can't see. But it gave her one thing, the truth acknowledged. The hunt for Christine Schürrer was over. But the story wasn't. Christine Schürrer's conviction made headlines across Sweden and beyond. The nation felt a collective exhale, a release of tension that had gripped Arboga for months. The monster who had taken Max and Saga, the woman who had tried to destroy Emma, was finally behind bars. But after the courtroom emptied, and the cameras left, and the reporters moved on to other stories, there was still the question that no verdict could answer. How does someone rebuild a life that has been shattered? The crime may have ended in a sentencing, but the story, Emma's story, was far from over. A town forever changed. The crimes in Arboga left a mark deeper than anyone expected. This was a small town, a quiet town, a place where parents let their kids walk alone, where neighbors trusted each other, where people left their doors unlocked without a second thought. But when news broke that a woman had broken into a home to murder 2 toddlers, everything changed overnight. Locks were replaced. Alarms were installed. Children weren't allowed out of sight. Every unfamiliar face became a potential threat. Arboga had lost something far more fragile than safety. It had lost innocence. And it wasn't just Arboga. All of Sweden felt the impact. A crime like this, so senseless, so personal, so cruel, shook the nation's understanding of violence. How could a jealous ex-girlfriend travel across countries to murder 2 children? How could someone look into the eyes of a toddler and commit such brutality? How could a human being have such cold, calculated intent? The questions haunted the country long after the trial ended. Christine behind bars. Christine was sent to a high-security women's prison, Hinsper, Sweden's most notorious correctional facility. She arrived with the same cold expression she had carried throughout the trial. And according to guards, she showed no remorse, no emotion, no acknowledgement of what she had done. Psychologists evaluated her extensively. Their reports described her as manipulative, emotionally detached, highly intelligent, possessive, capable of calculated violence. One psychologist wrote, "She displays a chilling inability to empathize." Christine maintained her innocence. She denied everything, even when confronted with evidence, testimony, and the overwhelming weight of the truth. In prison, she kept to herself, barely spoke, barely interacted, barely reacted, a human statue. But isolation doesn't create peace. It only deepens cracks. And slowly, quietly, Christine's life inside Hinseberg became a shadow of what she once imagined it would be. She appealed her conviction. Multiple times. Every appeal was denied, and each denial brought the same expression. Blank, cold, unmoved. The world expected anger or remorse or breakdown. Instead, they got nothing. A void. Emma's life after death. While Christine remained frozen in her silence, Emma was forced to rebuild her life from the ruins. Her physical healing took months. Her emotional healing, years, maybe a lifetime. The brain injuries left her with headaches, dizziness, memory gaps, and exhaustion. She couldn't walk without assistance for weeks. She struggled with vision, speech, and balance. Doctors told her she was lucky to be alive, but Emma didn't feel lucky. She had survived something no mother should ever endure. Her body bore the stars. Her mind held the trauma. Her heart carried the grief. Every night she saw flashes, the hallway, the figure, the blows, the screams, the darkness. Post-traumatic stress became her constant companion. Sleep was a battle. Silence felt dangerous. Sudden sounds made her flinch. She visited her children's graves every week. She brought candles. She brought flowers. She read them stories. Emma became a symbol, not of tragedy, but of unimaginable strength. She refused to let Christine define her life. She refused to let grief consume her. She refused to surrender to the darkness. In time, she spoke publicly about the attack, not to relive the pain, but to reclaim her voice. The voice Christine tried to silence. Her interviews were calm, soft, heartbreaking, and powerful. She said one sentence that stayed with everyone who heard it. "I survived for them." A nation reflects. The Arboga murders forced Sweden to confront uncomfortable truths. Stalking can escalate to deadly violence. Obsession can turn into murder. Domestic love triangles can become deadly. Women can be perpetrators of extreme brutality. And sometimes, the greatest danger comes from someone you once trusted. For years, criminologists studied the case. Experts wrote books. Documentaries were filmed. Students analyzed the timeline in classrooms. Law enforcement used Christine's case in seminars about early warning signs of obsessive violence. It became one of the most studied criminal cases in Swedish history. Not because of how complicated the investigation was, but because of how tragically preventable it might have been. Max and Saga's legacy. Even after the trial, their names continued to echo across Sweden. Children lost far too young often become symbols, small, fragile reminders of innocence stolen. But Max and Saga became something more. They changed how Sweden viewed jealousy-driven crime. They influenced how stalking cases were assessed. They inspired laws and discussions about risk assessment. They became a rallying cry for better protection against obsessive individuals. Their memory led to real change. Christine's final fate. In 2015, 7 years after the murders, Christine made headlines again. Not for appeals, not for confessions, but because she requested to be transferred to Germany, her home country. She argued she would feel safer serving her life sentence there. Sweden approved the transfer. When she arrived in Germany, she immediately attempted to challenge her Swedish sentence, hoping German courts would reduce it. The German court reviewed her crimes, considered her actions, and issued a chilling statement. The brutality of the murders and attempted murder show exceptional cruelty. The Swedish sentence shall stand. Christine would spend the rest of her life behind bars, not in Sweden, but in her homeland, alone, forgotten, buried behind the walls of a prison, just as she once tried to bury Emma. The quiet courage of survival. Emma rebuilt her life slowly, piece by piece. She remarried. She had another child. A step toward healing, not replacement. She smiled again. She laughed again. She loved again. But she never forgot. And she never pretended the pain was gone. She simply learned to live beside it. Unlike Christine, Emma did not let tragedy define her. She let it shape her into something stronger. A survivor, a mother, a fighter. And the children she lost, Max and Saga, lived on through her strength. A story that never leaves you. The Arboga murders are more than a crime story. They're a reminder of how fragile life is. How quickly obsession can turn deadly. How jealousy can become violence. How danger can come from someone you once trusted. And how trauma doesn't end when the headlines do. But it is also a story of something deeper, something almost miraculous. The will of a mother who refused to die. A woman who crawled back from the edge of death. To identify her attacker. To seek justice for her babies. And to rebuild a life that was stolen from her. It's a story about survival. About courage. About a mother's love that refused to be silenced. And that, in the darkest documentary we can tell, is the light that remains. A powerful reminder of the human spirit's resilience. If you've been moved by her story, please consider supporting organizations in your local community that provide aid and advocacy for victims of crime and their families. Their work is essential in helping survivors rebuild their lives. And if you find these in-depth explorations of justice compelling, please subscribe for more stories like this one. The guilty verdict closed a legal chapter, but for Emma Jangistig, a lifetime of grief and recovery had just begun. The physical wounds would heal, but the emotional scars, the loss of her 2 beloved children, would remain forever. The road back was long and arduous. She had to learn to live in a world that no longer had Max and Saga in it. The silence was a constant, painful reminder. But the same incredible strength that pulled her from a coma also propelled her forward. She was determined to live in defiance of the tragedy. Torgny Helgren, who had stood by her side through the darkest days, remained a pillar of support. Their shared trauma forged an unbreakable bond. In the years that followed, Emma made a conscious choice to embrace life again. She and Torgny stayed together, and their family grew. They had more children, bringing new life and new laughter into a home that had known so much sorrow. These children were not a replacement for Max and Saga. Nothing could ever replace them. But they were a continuation of life, a symbol of hope triumphing over despair. Emma has chosen to keep the memory of Max and Saga alive. She speaks of them, shares their stories, and ensures they are never forgotten. Every year, on March 17th, she lights candles for them, a quiet memorial to the 2 bright lights extinguished far too soon. Our journey is a profound story of resilience, showing the immense capacity of the human heart to endure the unimaginable and find a way to rebuild, piece by broken piece. Emma Jangastig lost almost everything on that terrible day in 2008, but she survived. She found the strength to give her children the justice they deserved, and then she found the courage to live. She is a mother, a survivor, and a powerful reminder that even after the most profound darkness, the human spirit can find its way back to the light.